Also with us on the line, Maurice Brosnan of the 42. Maurice, evening.
Joe, how are we?
Yeah, very well. So it was pretty clear they were a group that did not want to be one-hit wonders, both in the comments from Monica and Stacey, and then just everything that the team has said over the last couple of days. And really, you'd have to say they saved their best performance for the final, and it's ultimately a very comfortable scoreline.
Yeah, it was a champions performance, really. I often think, Joe, that there's a human element of us all where we all secretly tap into that chip on our shoulder, even if it's slightly manufactured. So I don't know where they as written off as maybe they interpret it there, but
they absolutely weren't. I did, like, honestly, God, paranoia doesn't do it justice. And the amount of them saying, "Oh, we were written off by everybody." They weren't written off by anybody.
But Joe, every team secretly taps into that at some stage. I remember, the process obsessed team, the Jim Gavin's Dublin, which we all heard about, and then Paddy Andrews comes on the football show and starts talking about their obsession with Mayo and the media loving with Mayo, and I think every team taps into that. The team, I actually, for a couple of different reasons, I mean this in an absolute positive sense, that this Meath's team remind me a lot of the Donegal men team under Jim McGuinness. There's a lot of comparisons there. They actually, I heard he told a story on Tomás O'Shea's podcast recently that he held up a newspaper article when they were rated something like the 27th team in Ireland. And again, tapping into that chip on the shoulder mentality. Even just the way, you mentioned their performance there, the way they are coached, I have to say, is just so impressive. Now, if the team goes out and mirrors them, the same way that happened to McGuinness's Donegal, if the team goes out and mirrors them, it probably isn't the best spectacle. We'll put that in the intriguing bracket. But if a team comes out and, like Kerry does, and tries to press high and you get styles to make fights, I just think that they're such an extremely well coached team. You look at the way they approached the kick out. That was a 12-man zonal press. We would have given a lot of praise to Kerry for doing that when they broke Crokes in that time. You look at the way I think their third goal from that kick out, that's 3 passes. No player makes a play. There's no delay whatsoever. That's a kick pass, a hand pass, and even sort of a goal. Their first goal again comes from a throw in, but you talk about the manipulation of space and the way some teams have started to approach. Rory Gallagher's Derry have 5 men on the inside line now. There's been a lot of talk about that this year. Dublin did this thing with a 3-pronged kind of attack on the edge of the D. I'm pretty sure Meath had only 1 player in the 45 for that, for an attack, but it's just creating space for Emma Troy. So I think they're just a phenomenally well coached team, and that was a champions performance.
I definitely take the Donegal comparison for sure. The blanket defence makes things very difficult for any opposition, and it's telling that Kerry, who had scored all these goals in advance of the final, couldn't really make a breakthrough aside from the goal that we mentioned to Monica, the lob, which really, let's be honest, was an effort at a point. So you chalk that up as bad luck as much as anything. So they stifled Kerry at one end. On that goal that you mentioned, and again, this was the Donegal comparison when Donegal in 2012 had players flooding forward and great running ability. I did watch it though, and I did think to myself, this is unbelievably naive on Kerry's part. For people who didn't see the game, Kerry had this tactic of kickouts, which, in and of itself had a chance of working. They had lots of players in a certain part of midfield, and they'd sprint to one side of the pitch and create an overload and try and win the ball. But if you look at the kickout which led to the Meath goal, what they have is a very, very populated midfield. Kerry have virtually no players back defending. So, in effect, it's the ultimate tightrope act. If they don't win that ball in midfield and Meath catch it and get a run, there's no one at home. And it just seemed like a crazy way to set up to me, because really, as much as you want to populate midfield, you're not going to win every kick out. And with that running ability that Meath have, Kerry just looked so vulnerable at the moment they didn't win the kick out, and so approved in that goal, which was kind of decisive in some ways. So I think Kerry management really have to think about the way they set up for some of those kickouts.
But I think that kickout is nearly a guarantee of possession almost 99% of the time. What you're talking about is the bunch and break. A lot of teams use this. This is kind of a coach has come in and it's this is 101. You get a big bunch and they split all sides. And in an ideal sense, especially when Meath are pressing zonal, the worst case scenario is one player just stands there. Because if they're on a zonal press and one player just stands in the middle, they're probably going to be in space. Now the problem is that the kick out needs to be a dart, like it needs to be right in your chest. And unfortunately, this wasn't. It was floated kind of high. It was kind of one of those loopy kickouts that, as you mentioned, you lose. And then suddenly, in an ideal sense, not that I would encourage this whatsoever, Joe, but in an ideal sense, as soon as you lose that ball, you should probably foul.
Yes.
You should. So, and that probably just takes a bit of what you want to call it, a bit of game smarts, and suddenly then you dive for that. There was a moment, I don't know if you remember, in the Kieran Murphy kicked the point under the Cusack stand side. She was running up the side, but Kerry were breaking up the field, and they had caught this was a typical situation where Meath had floated forward, but then they turned over the ball, and they're actually caught for once on the wrong side of the ball. They didn't have numbers back, and there was a chance for Kerry to go, and suddenly, in your head, you're probably thinking, is there a goal on here? And Vicky Wall just very, very tactfully fouls in the halfway line. It wasn't I know she ran into some trouble at the very end of the game with fouls, but this was just a slight little tug. It was a foul in the halfway line. It's stifling momentum, and you can filter players behind the ball. Now, they conceded a point, but it probably was just a bit of, that's the level of coaching. I probably think that's a slight evolution in teams as well, that they develop those game smarts, and it probably just comes with experience, really.
There were amazingly interesting comments from the Meath manager, Eamon Murray, after the game. And this is in light of Vicky Wall, who was, outstanding and just stands out a mile. And you can see, it didn't take the smartest of Australian scouts to say, she'll do a job, no problem for us. And Orla Lally is going as well. So they're going to Australia. And Eamon Murray is undecided, it seems, but certainly some of his backroom team are going and may well be part of Colin O'Rourke's backroom team next year, which is interesting. But he had a line which just jumped out to me as so striking. He said, losing players, so the likes of Wall and Lally, he said, losing players, you're probably good enough as a team to win 3 or 4 in a row, but we won't. We'll worry about that next week. I thought it was amazing that he said, we won't. I mean, most managers, whatever they think privately, would not come out and say publicly, we're not going to win it. They would say, well, we'll do our best, we'll be thereabouts, there's more talent coming through. It seemed like there was this real sense, on his part anyway, of like, once we lose the likes of Vicky Wall and Lally, we're not winning a 3rd in a row. I thought it was an amazingly honest comment, surprising comment to make publicly. Incredibly honest, as you mentioned. I also think it probably demonstrates obviously Eamon Murray kind of attracted a bit of heat for his comments initially when he commented on, but this was before the news had been confirmed that Vicky was going to go, but he passed some comments about her loss and the reason she's going and the sport, the AFLW as a whole, and his thoughts on that. And I probably think this puts those more so in context, just the sheer devastation that they feel at her leaving. Just on the first part of your question, Joe, as well, I know you watch her now and you look at this elite athlete running around Croke Park and think how this is very obvious for an AFLW club to swoop in. You'd be surprised. Like, you would genuinely be surprised at how it took this long. Like Vicky Wall went to a combine in Melbourne in 2019. There was vision. I mean, she was looking for a move, I would say, for a couple of seasons now, and there was clubs not biting. And then suddenly she wins an All-Ireland last year, and that's the headline grab, and they start to swoop in after that. But a lot of the clubs who reacted at the All-Ireland final stage last year were too late, because the one club that showed interest from a long way out was obviously North Melbourne, and the other one was a club based in Western Australia. But a lot of clubs probably weren't as clued into her ability as maybe they should have been. And I also just think that it just goes to show I mean this with the greatest amount of respect, she was a different athlete then. Like the improvement in her in the last 2 years has been absolutely phenomenal. And I do think there's probably an element of, whether it is Vicky Wall or not, there probably is an element where you look at a player like her and I don't know if you got that sense for the second goal, where there was just a rise of anticipation as she was driving to the middle. You can nearly hear the clatter of terraces, people getting off their feet, that kind of sense of a crowd buzzing as soon as she broke with the ball. And to see, whatever about the definition of tackles, to see players penalised when they actually have the ball in their hands. This is a wider conversation, I know, but it probably is something that's a spectacle we want to see in the sport, whether it's Vicky Wall doing it or anybody else. And I probably think that's something that, it's a takeaway for me, definitely from that final, that we need to maybe address that slightly. Well, Camogie did a couple of years ago. They allowed more physicality at the behest of the players, and I think ladies football maybe it'll go that way. On the AFLW situation, so Wall and Lally of Meath are going. Amy Mulholland is left for non-football reasons 2020. Blaine Mackin, Eric O'Shea, Anya McDonough. I think we're over 20 now, Irish players. 21, in the AFLW. And I suppose, your point about Vicky Wall is interesting in that a lot of the players now could say to themselves, well, if I get myself really in shape here, there's every chance I'll go. And the AFLW, the move to professionalism has gone very well, and they're expanding to 18 teams, it seems. And I think Cora Staunton was making the point that increasingly playing both won't be a possibility the way the seasons will go. So this threat, if you want to call it that, is very real for the women's game here. Is there cause to be overly concerned? I mean, it's disappointing, obviously, to lose the best players, but you kind of wish them well, and you say, well, look, life is for living, and there'll be more players behind them to replace them, and we'll still have a vibrant game here. Or do you sense from the ladies' game that this is seen as a real problem and a real threat?
You might humour me here for a second, Joe. Like I heard, so there is some critics of this. I heard Anthony talk on OTB AM this morning about this. I thought that was very interesting. I have to say, I
didn't catch what he had to say, actually. So maybe tell me and the listeners.
So there was his criticism was that you've got a burgeoning sport, a sport that's developing at a rapid pace. You've got over 45,000 people in at an All-Ireland final, and now you're essentially gutting the best talents to bring them to Australia, to a sport that is still developing. I think he made the point about the money isn't necessarily that great. I think he made the point, the All-Ireland final attendance versus the grand final attendance this year. The grand final this year had, I believe he said 21,000. Now, it's my understanding that was COVID influenced, to be honest. So I don't necessarily know, does that comparison stack up? I would just make the point, and I fully appreciate why there is, people are fully entitled to see be disappointed to see Vicky Wall leaving to go to Australia. But you mentioned players there, for example, like Amy Mulholland. Our 21 players, are they all really a loss to ladies football? Like Amy Mulholland would have gone anyway. She moved to Perth for non-football reasons. Yeah. That's a remarkable story. Like she went to play local. This is in Saturday morning in footy in the park type of stuff, and managed to go from there and build her way up to the WAFLW, which is the second tier, the reserve league. Impressed there, and now entered the draft and got drafted by a club. But she's not a loss to ladies football. You mentioned Cora Staunton. For her own reasons, she wasn't going to be playing Mayo. Breed Stack wasn't going to be playing with Cork. Aileen Gilroy, as far as I remember, Aileen Gilroy had opted out from Mayo in her last year because of her commute from Wexford. Anya McDonough was not involved with Galway last year. She was playing basketball with NURG Mystics, so she's not really a loss for ladies football. Now, there are some players who are a loss. I don't know how much more longer that will last, because essentially, Joe, there's been a new CBA this year and a collective bargaining agreement, and the sport is moving rapidly towards full professionalism, and you're going to see 2-3 year contracts. But simultaneous with that, you've seen a lot of investment in academies. So now we have a production line of players who, there was a need to look externally, because, like, let's be honest, the talent was spread very, very finely for the last couple of seasons within Australia. That's no longer the case anymore. I know this isn't going to grab money headlines, and it's not the most, but I think this stuff is nuanced. Some players are definitely there for money. I would counter Anthony on that. They weren't there originally, but there's, under this new CBA, there's now scope for players to be paid, upwards of six figures for a half season, for a half year season. And Irish players, it's my understanding there's a couple of Irish players now in that bracket. Other players are just there because of life experiences. I spent the last 2 years in Australia, Joe. I can assure you there was no AFL clubs interested in me. I find it difficult enough to get junior Gaelic football teams to have a look at me. But I went there for the life experience. You look at the men's game right now, we're missing top-end talent. I'm not saying these are the best players in the country, but they'd be close. I look at Jack McCaffrey, I look at Paul Mannion, I look at Peter Cook in Galway, I look at Michael Quinlivan, Caelan Mooney. For all their own reasons, they decided not to play football this year because they have lives outside this stuff. They want to see the world, they want to have other experiences. So I just don't. I think it might be a tad overplayed, to be honest. Yeah, no, it's a fair point, and I see that it's interesting. The average salaries across the 18 clubs have jumped 94%. See, it's a really burgeoning, growing professional situation. And that was in a year, Joe, and there's a new CBA at the end of this year, so that's going to grow again. 94%. So the average salary had been 23,000 Australian dollars. It's suddenly up to 46,000, and then, as you said, players on tier 1 contracts up to kind of 71,000 territory. So you throw that in, full-time professionalism, the sunshine. I guess it's a weird conversation to have, because it doesn't reach a conclusion whereby you can say, well, we need to ban it happening. I mean, what are you going to do? It's just a phenomenon, and I guess we observe it and we see how popular the move becomes, and maybe it gets to a point where it starts feeling increasingly uneasy, or maybe it levels off. I guess in part, not to make too clunky a segue, the Shane Walsh situation is kind of in that sphere as well. So Shane Walsh, stunning All-Ireland performance, is moving from his home club in Galway, Kilkerran Clonberne, and he is joining Dublin Giants, I guess, Kilmacud Crokes, and he has made the point that he's 29. He lives in Dublin, he is studying in Dublin, and trekking up and down to Galway is taking its toll. And may well move back to Galway and resume with his club post studies.
And his club came out and talked about doing everything they possibly could to stop the move. I'm not sure if they've objected or launched an appeal with the GA to stop the move. I don't know on what grounds they can do that. Like, Shane Walsh clearly is living in Dublin, and to me his reasons seem perfectly fair. It's the kind of ire directed at, I guess, Walsh or Kilmacud seems to be almost a fear of this becoming increasingly the done thing. But then again, this has been the done thing for a long time, and there's never been that avalanche.
Yeah, exactly. And to be honest, Joe, I think Shane is just unlucky that he got caught in the perfect storm, in that we now have a split season has been as much discussed. So this is naturally, after an Ireland final, it becomes out. It's going to be headline news. It's going to give us a lot of talking points. It's also the fact that coming after an Ireland final, an arguably man of the match performance in an Ireland final. This was rumoured months ago. There was a lot of talk about this. I imagine if it came at the time, there probably wouldn't have been as much fallout, but it's just the fact that it came when it did. And also then, on top of all of that, you go into the rural versus urban divide, and Clare and Clonberne, who are a very small intermediate club here in Galway, versus Kilmacud Crokes, who are, if we're going to have GA super clubs, they probably fall into that bracket. I've had a lot of debates here locally in Galway with people about this. I nearly think the more removed from the GA you are, the more kind of sane a reaction you have to it. There are definitely people who think, he's done it for the last 10 months, commuted from Dublin to Galway. That is, why can't he do the same thing for 2 months for his club? I personally think if you're working and living in Dublin, you should be entitled to, play football in Dublin. We're talking about an amateur sport here. There's no ownership over anybody. I fully appreciate that Kildare and Clonberne were the making of Shane Walsh, but Shane Walsh has been very good to his club too. Before All Ireland's semi-final this year, he was at his club at a cool camp. I'm talking about the day before he played in Ireland semi-final. You heard about other players locking themselves away. In 2020, Joe, his performances that year as they went on a promotion push were sensational. Absolutely. I remember there was back-to-back games they played. Killarn in around July of 2020, he kicked 111 of 114. Yeah. A week later, they played at the Aran Islands. He kicked 8 of 9 points in the second half. So he's been good for them. They've been good to him. I personally think some of those comments were over the top, particularly stuff about a death in the area. I think that's just that's nonsense, really. We're talking about an amateur player deciding to play football for a few years somewhere else.
It seemed a bit OTT. So some of the comments coming from the Kilcairn chief, Ian Hines, he was saying, we tried to persuade him not to. This is them trying to persuade Shane Walsh. But he said his mind was made up. We're not going to let him go without a fight. Absolutely no way. We've only 700 or 800 members in the club, and it's just rural Ireland against Dublin again. It's just not on. I mean, it's not rural Ireland against Dublin. It's one player, very understandably saying, I study in Dublin, I live in Dublin. It's a long drive up and down all the time. I love my club, but come on, I can't keep doing this. I'm 30 years of age now. And all very, very valid reasons. But, the club chief went on to say, the village is like a morgue today. It's a death in the family. People are just devastated. But look, we're going to fight it. End of story. What does he mean when he says fight it? What grounds do they have to fight it? Can they just object to this and it's stuck in limbo forever?
No, they can lodge an appeal, and then Shane has to go. I think one representative of the club he wants to transfer to Kilmacud and explains his reasons for the move. I think there are some legal grounds for. It was my understanding that for a while, if you were based somewhere purely to study, you actually couldn't transfer to a club there. But right. Shane lives in Dublin. He worked in a bank up until this year. I think then he transferred to go back, as far as I know, to be a PE teacher. I think, Joe, as well, you probably do have ambitions to play at the highest level of football all the time. And, for example, Shane Walsh wasn't eligible to play Sigerson football this year. Hibernia, obviously, the college he's studying in don't have a team. I think he looked into avenues to play elsewhere. They weren't available to him. So you probably want to test yourself at a higher level too. He has made the point in his own. They released a statement from Paul Byrne over the weekend. He made the point himself that he will return to play for his club. This is not a permanent thing. This is just what he's based in Dublin. So
he's not going to return if they keep going on like this. I mean, this just seems this seems crazy stuff. This is OTT. This is just a normal. Well, he's not normal. He's far from. But it's just an amateur, and you're like, over our dead body, you leave. Perfect entitled to play with whatever club he wants to. This again with the female players going to the Australian Women's League, it's almost like yes, the club are upset, but it also speaks to this fear, I suspect, that's across all rural clubs. Because I'm amazed this doesn't happen more.
Yeah, and Joe, I think it's nearly there's probably there's an element of ownership over. I think not, and this is not unique to rural Ireland. I'm just talking about GA clubs in general. There's an element of ownership that you kind of owe it to us to, I would know of players who were criticised for not flying home from Europe to play for their clubs. Like that goes on locally within Galway. I know of players who decided to go to America and would get very heavy local criticism because they missed out on a championship game, because there's this general idea that they owe it to their clubs. And this I know this doesn't make very good radioing when, I'm here agreeing with everything you're saying and you're agreeing with me. But this feeds back to my point about the idea that if you're removed from this, if you were looking at this not through the lens of the dyed in the wood Gaels, GA club is the heartblood of my community, you totally understand the reasons or the motivation for somebody to want to take this opportunity. But it's suddenly that you're probably looking through it through coloured lens, and you start to feed into this idea that, no, he owes it to us to be here to help us go up to senior football. I would say if you maybe give this a bit of time, I wonder would his reaction be similar. They seem like very emotive comments. As I mentioned, this was rumoured months ago. I wonder would Shane Walsh not even better off putting this to bed before, because it's easy to that in hindsight, but before a sensational Ireland performance? And is there the same fallout? Is there the same manner of discussion? I highly doubt it. As you mentioned, these transfers happen all the time. They happen within counties. We've had situations here in Galway of very high profile situations of players transferring from one club to the other. And it happens obviously all the time when you're people living and working in Dublin. So I fully appreciate why again, this goes back to the Vicky Wall situation. You're absolutely entitled to be disappointed about seeing them go, but you probably should be able to understand, at least appreciate their motivation for doing so.
Interesting times. Maurice Brosnan of the 42. Cheers, Maurice. Thanks a mil.
Thanks a million, Joe.